Hey folks, Dr. Lava here. Well, in my previous video, I talked about 8 creature designs that ended up going unused in Pokemon Black and White, and in this episode, I'll be covering 10 more lost Pokemon designs. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, for context, I recommend going back and watching that episode first. But just in case you are watching out of order, I'll just quickly reiterate that the bulk of the information you'll be seeing in this video comes from a series of interviews with lead Pokemon designer Ken Sugimori, which were first published in several 2011 issues of a Japanese magazine called Nintendo Dream. These interviews had never been fully translated into English before, so over the past few months I tracked them down, translated them, and published them on my website. These interviews contain information about scrapped Pokemon designs, but for the most part, these Japanese magazines don't provide any scrapped artwork. So most of what you'll be seeing in this video will be artwork that I commissioned in order to depict Sugimori's descriptions as accurately as possible. Okay, so with all that said, here's part 3 of this channel's coverage of all the best unused content from Pokemon Black and White version. In Nintendo Dream Volume 204, Sugimori explains that his team ended up designing more grass Pokemon than the game's planners actually wanted to include, and that for the sake of the region's elemental balance, some of these grass types were relegated to either Black or White as version exclusives, and at least one of them was scrapped entirely. More specifically, Sugimori reveals that the Petilil family originally consisted of 3 stages, but one of the stages ended up getting cut, although he doesn't specify which stage. In this series of interviews, Sugimori repeatedly states that many of the Pokemon in Generation 5 were designed to fill roles once occupied by Pokemon in Generation 1, like how the families of Pidgey, Rattata, and Clefairy were replaced by the Pidove, Patrat, and Minccino families. With that in mind, it seems likely that the Petilil family was originally designed to fill the role of the Oddish family, and that this scrapped Pokemon was the middle stage that once connected Petilil with Lilligant. And if that was the case, this lost grass Pokemon probably won't be making a return in any future generations. Because while Game Freak has added new Pokemon to the beginning and end of evolutionary lines countless times over the years, in some cases even with Pokemon that had been scrapped previously, they've never once added a new Pokemon into the middle. In Volume 204's interview, Sugimori says that originally, Dwebble and Crustle were furnace Pokemon, and their shells were made out of kiln-fired pottery. But the design team felt that these ceramic shells made them look too slow and awkward, so they revised them into the more earthy designs that we know today. Throughout these interviews, Sugimori mentions quite a few Pokemon that had their elemental types changed mid-development. So as furnace Pokemon, it seems likely that Dwebble and Crustle were initially half fire type, especially when you take into account that in the anime, rather than orange, Crustle is actually depicted as more of a dark red color. And also, in the release versions of Black and White, Dwebble's shiny variant is red as well. When Game Freak changes a Pokemon's color during development, that original color is sometimes repurposed and used for the shiny version of that Pokemon in the game's final build, like they did in Generation 2 with Jumpluff, Mareep, and Scizor, just to name a few examples. To be clear, this is speculation on my part, as Sugimori's description of Dwebble and Crustle's origin is briefer than most of the other Pokemon in these interviews, and he doesn't address their typing whatsoever. But with that said, it does seem likely that as kiln-fired furnace Pokemon, originally they were half fire type, and that these traces of red are leftovers that can clue us in to one more aspect of their original design. In Volume 201, Sugimori reveals that it was actually during the days of Diamond and Pearl that he first came up with the idea for a judo fighter and designed the Pokemon that we now call Throw. But Game Freak didn't end up using that design in Diamond and Pearl, and as a matter of fact, we don't even have any clues as to what that Gen 4 version of Throw might have looked like. But in a later interview, Sugimori explains that during Black and White's development, he revisited that early Throw design and polished it up a bit, even creating a rival in the form of Sock the Karate Master. He goes on to say that Throw and Sock's early Gen 5 designs originally had horns but not eyebrows, but that these details were changed in order to differentiate Throw and Sock from Thundurus and Tornadus. These alterations were deemed necessary because at that point in development, just like Throw, Tornadus' original color was red. Landorus didn't exist yet, so the design team decided that they needed to make some changes to these two pairs of Pokemon in order to make them more distinct. In Volume 201, Sugimori explains that the design team originally planned for a rivalry between Karrablast's beetle family and a family of snails that ultimately ended up getting scrapped. In Black and White's final build, the Karrablast family did receive counterparts in the form of the Shelmet family, but Sugimori explains that during development, Shelmet was initially being worked on independently from the rivalry between the beetles and the snails. From the beginning, the designers had always intended for a Scavalier to be wearing some kind of armor, but originally it was a completely different kind of armor. However, a Scavalier was transformed when the designers came up with the idea to combine the development of Shelmet with a beetle and snail rivalry. By doing so, Karrablast could steal Shelmet's shell during evolution, and it could then become a Scavalier's armor. When these ideas were combined, not only was a Scavalier transformed, but there was no longer any use for the original family of snail rivals. And as a result, this snail family was thrown out and didn't end up getting used in the game's final build. In April of 1997, a little more than a year after Gen 1 first released in Japan, Ken Sugimori sat down for an interview with another Japanese magazine, this one called MicroGroup Game Review. As something of a gift to the magazine's publishers, Sugimori provided artwork for the magazine's cover that included 3 original monster designs. He explained in the interview that these designs shouldn't be considered canon Pokemon, but rather they came from a world similar to the world of Pokemon. But despite this explanation, one of these creatures clearly became Tyranitar and found its way into Gold and Silver. The spinning top creature appears to have evolved into the Hitmontop design found in the demo of Gold and Silver that was exhibited about 7 months later at Spaceworld 97, which was ultimately finalized into the Hitmontop design that made its way into Gold and Silver's release versions. However, what became of the turtle is still a matter of debate within the Pokemon community, though it's usually considered to have been revised into Generation 5's Tirtouga. The similarities are evident, but on the other hand, the MicroGroup Turtle also shares a lot of similarities with Dreadnought in Generation 8. In that same interview with MicroGroup, Sugimori explained that he often reconsiders and re-examines his past designs when he's creating new designs. So what I think is most likely the case is that the MicroGroup Turtle ultimately became Tirtouga in Generation 5, but it also ended up providing inspiration for the design of Dreadnought more than 20 years later. Okay, if you enjoyed this episode and you want to see more Lost Pokemon history, you might want to subscribe and maybe check out my past videos as well. And also check me out on Twitter, where I cover the same kind of material that I cover here, but in a more bite-sized format. I'd like to give a big thanks to my Patreon supporters. This video wouldn't have been possible without their support, which helped finance all the translations, as well as all the original artwork. If you want to see more high-quality, research-heavy content, I ask that you please consider signing up to support my channel for a few bucks a month. It helps to make sure that I can continue producing interview translations, as well as videos just like this one. If this episode contained any factual errors, I'll leave corrections and clarifications in this video's description, as well as a list of all my sources. Okay, that wraps things up for this episode. Thanks for watching, folks. See you next time.